Welcome to Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning for Tuesday, October 8th. I'm your host, Tom Orr. The Oregon game in 4 days, the game against Michigan in 53 days. Unsurprisingly, we're going to be focusing much more on that Oregon game than on the game against Michigan. This is a big game week for the Buckeyes. Kind of feels a little like Michigan week. That might be a little sacrilegious to say, but the excitement around Columbus is palpable this week. Today, we're going to be talking about the three factors that might really decide who wins this Ohio State-Oregon game. Point spread very tight. Buckeyes favored by about 3 points. Should be a really good game. Joined by Tony Gerdeman of BuckeyeHuddle.com today. Tony, the first positional matchup that I want to look at is just, can Ohio State win in the trenches? Can the Ohio State offensive line beat the Oregon defensive line? The Ohio State offensive line has looked pretty darn good this year. The Oregon defensive line has some definite difference makers, especially in the pass rush. But it feels like if the Ohio State offensive line can just sort of hold serve or win slightly, they don't need to run for 8 yards a carry or anything like that. If they can run for 4.5 yards a carry and keep Will Howard upright, that feels like that might be the single biggest factor that goes into which team wins this game.
Yeah, and that average also depends on how many home runs are there. If it's a 5.2 yard per carry and there are no home runs, that's a winning number for me for Ohio State in terms of running the ball. If it's just consistently staying on schedule, being efficient and effective, we've seen them all season long. They 5.3 yards per carry against Michigan State, 5.1 against Iowa, but it was an effective number, and it was a number that was higher over the first three quarters, and then things kind of slowed down because you're just running the clock out, and the defense knows it. I look at what Oregon has been able to do defensively, and when you look at the line of scrimmage on both sides of the ball for Oregon, but defensively, they faced one really good rushing attack, and that was Boise State, facing the best running back in the nation, and they gave up 221 yards rushing, 6.7 yards per carry. Everybody else, they've essentially shut down. Oregon State rushed for 131 yards against them, but UCLA, 47 yards, Michigan State, 59 yards. Not really effective running games from either of those schools, regardless of the opponent. So it's interesting that Oregon's defense has kind of done what they're supposed to do, but I don't know that they've imposed their will completely on anybody to this point. They're supposed to stop Michigan State and UCLA. You're supposed to be better than they were against Boise State. Boise State was able to run the ball. So I would like to see if Oregon's defense in the line of scrimmage can just keep from giving ground, because when they faced a running attack that is potent, they couldn't. Can they do it this week?
Well, it feels like they're going to face a pretty potent rushing attack this week. And if that rushing attack remains potent for the Buckeyes, that might be the single biggest thing that helps keep Will Howard in clean pockets, because we have seen some real nasty looking pass rushes from the Oregon Ducks. Aiden Childs was straight up not having a good time on Friday night between Birch and Uiagalelei coming off the edges. The tackles for Ohio State have been good, feels like should be okay in most games, but this is definitely going to be the steepest challenge they face. If they're able to run the ball, that probably helps with the pass pro, the pass rush, forces Oregon to make some difficult choices.
Yeah, for sure. And they had 4 sacks against UCLA, 5 against Michigan State the past 2 weeks. But you go back to that Boise State game when there was a running game, they only had 1 sack against Broncos quarterback. So if they can control that line of scrimmage, and then maybe when you're bringing more in to stop the run, then we know there's the play action that will be effective, has been effective, the intermediate stuff for Will Howard. But yeah, if they can keep him clean, then there's really, at this point, what can't the Ohio State offense do? Because we assume they'll be able to run it effectively enough. I don't see them getting shut down. If they get shut down, then all bets are completely off on what the passing game will do. But with the offensive line winning, and Josh Simmons, I think at left tackle, people are very confident in him. We've seen Josh Fryer have his ups and downs at right tackle. It'll be interesting to see if they attack him in some ways. And then also, they get pressure up the middle as well from their defensive tackles. So that's going to be something for Seth McLaughlin at center, Tegra Chabot at right guard, Donovan Jackson at left guard. All of these guys will have certainly their opposition against the pass And I'm interested to see how it goes for Seth McLaughlin, who I just saw was the highest rated center per PFF this past weekend. So what can he do against what will be his biggest test to date?
So that's factor number one. Factor number two, we're not going far. We're just sort of flipping the field here. How does the Ohio State defensive line hold up against the Oregon offensive line? Because if the Ducks can run the ball, this is real old school football coach talk. I remember, Earl Bruce being in the press box at Ohio State, a decade or so back. And, his big thing was always who wins the line of scrimmage. He was like, all right. Yeah, we know. But this is one of these games where, yes, this is really, you win the game and lose the game in the trenches. Can the Buckeye defensive line hold up against the Oregon offensive line, especially in the run game? Yes, can they get to the quarterback, Dillon Gabriel, when Oregon's throwing the ball? But really, can Jordan James run the ball? Will Jordan James have holes? Because he had 150 yards in the first half against Michigan State, and there were a bunch of times when he didn't get touched till he was 5-6 yards downfield. If he has that kind of a game against Ohio State, that is going to be a big, big thing that pushes the needle towards an Oregon win instead of an Ohio State win. You look at the stats, this Ohio State defense on the whole and defensive line has been pretty good. They've generated a lot of pressure on the quarterbacks over the last few weeks. Hasn't necessarily always translated into sacks. They have had a couple, had some key turnovers that they've forced. Can this Ohio State defensive line, Tony, at least, they don't need to win, but they need to not lose, I think, is kind of how I'm looking at this one.
Yeah, and you look right now, Ohio State, I believe, has the number 3 rush defense in the nation. That's both in yards per game and average yard per carry allowed. And I was looking to see when most of their yards have been given up, because we know the 30-yarder that they gave up in the fourth quarter against Iowa was to the second-team defense. But so they've given up 363 yards this season on 161 carries. 219 of those yards have come with Ohio State up by 15 or more points, which generally means the second half, the fourth quarter. And so over half of their carries allowed have come with Ohio State up by more than 2 touchdowns, and then 2/3 of their rushing yards basically while Ohio State has a comfortable lead. And yet, even with that comfortable lead, those carries where the opponents are making most of their hay, if you will, 2.6 yards per carry allowed in those instances. So even with some of the bigger runs that have come later in the game, it's still a very low average for the opposition. And then you look at Oregon's running game. Which is the real Oregon running game? We know they struggled against Idaho to start the season, 107 yards, 109 yards against Boise State. There are all kinds of questions, like what's going wrong with the Oregon running game? And then they exploded for 240 yards against Oregon State. Everything's fixed, right? Well, Oregon State then the next week goes out and allows 263 yards rushing to Purdue, and then 176 yards rushing to Colorado State. So this is another example of Oregon basically just doing what they're allowed to do, like being allowed to do this. Ohio State hasn't allowed people to run on them. And so if Oregon is only doing what they're allowed to do so far this season, can they run the ball? We know they're going to try. Jordan James is a very good running back. They've Jordan Whittington. They've got other guys there as well, but they need to impose their will. And that hasn't happened against Ohio State yet. Iowa got like the bulk of their carries or the bulk of their runs, basically 3 carries in that game against Ohio State. Not only does Oregon need a couple of home runs, some 30-yarders, something like that, they need a lot of 6-yarders on 1st and 10. And if they don't get those, then that pass rush gets dialed up as well. So I'm just interested to see if Oregon can impose their will in the running game and how Ohio State will handle that if they do.
Yeah, one of my favorite stats to look at is from the college football nerds, and it's sort of relative performance to what the opponent typically does. So if you run for 5 yards per carry against a team that typically allows 4, that's a really good performance. If you run for 5 yards per carry against a team that typically allows 6, that's not a good performance, even though they're both 5 yards per carry. Oregon is 23rd in the nation in relative performance in rushing yards per game, and 13th in the nation in rushing yards per attempt. So that's a pretty solid run game. It's a team where you sort of, if you adjust for the defenses, it's a pretty still good running game, and seemingly has gotten gotten better as the season has gone along. We've talked about that swap out at center that they made in the middle of that Boise State game. That feels like that is really potentially a very low-key defining moment in that season. Speaking of low-key defining moments, Tony, these are maybe not even low-key defining moments. The third thing that really could decide this game is just which quarterback makes the big mistake. It's really interesting how Dillon Gabriel and Will Howard have very similar kind of stories, both transferred in this year from Big 12 schools, both veteran guys who are not necessarily Heisman contenders at their previous schools, but have sort of been brought in to be solid, reliable. They don't have to win the game necessarily, but they can't lose the game. They've both had some moments where they've made great plays. They've both had a couple throws they want back. It feels like they've each kind of had like one or two throws a game that was like, ooh, that's not gonna be fun in the film room. Dillon Gabriel turned the ball over twice on interceptions in the red zone against Michigan State. And, it seems a little reductionist to say they don't necessarily need to win the game. They just can't lose the game, both of these quarterbacks. But if one of these quarterbacks throws a pick six, I'm going to say that team probably loses. Is that overly simplistic here?
Well, I do think that will increase the odds. Like when you block a punt, how Urban Meyer would always say, like 90% of the teams when you block a punt win a game. That's really going to increase your average. But I do think there are going to be some scores in this one. But losing one of those possessions and then giving up a score to the defense is not going to be any kind of recipe for success for any offense. And when I look at these two guys, it's going to be very interesting to see who gets the closest to crossing the line from making the play that wins the game, doing everything you can, going above and beyond to win the game, and then, you've done too much. You shouldn't have done that. You should have slid rather than trying to dive for a first down. You shouldn't have tried to thread that needle with that pass, and now you've given the ball back to the opposition. So these are two guys that really, really want to win this game, looking for some big wins for their respective resumes. And so they're going to do everything they can, and they'll run. They'll try to get every single yard they can. But through all of this, while they're being aggressive and attacking, they still have to be, I think, above all else, smart. And it'll be interesting when we talk to Ryan Day, Chip Kelly, like, do you want somebody to be smart or do you want them to give everything they've got? Because the answer is going to be, I want them to give smartly everything they've got. And you look at Dillon Gabriel, he's thrown 3 interceptions this season. He's thrown 6 each of the past 2 years. Each season throws 6. He is not a turnover guy, but all 3 of his interceptions so far this season have come in 2 Big Ten games. So, I don't expect him to be a turnover machine in this one. I do wonder how careful each of them will be thinking in their minds. I can't be errant with anything. So does that make them more cautious, which then slows them down a little bit? I think it's fascinating how each of these quarterbacks will operate in this game. Kind of have to block everything out and just go attack it. But then also, hey, don't screw it up, bub.
Yeah, exactly. Just do everything right and don't do anything wrong. What a game plan. Thank you, Coach Gerdeman. That's a winning game plan for sure. If the guys just go out there and execute it, feel good about your chances. If not, you can give the Hugh Freeze post-game speech about how it's everyone's fault but your own. Listen, sounds win-win to me. And if you lose, well, there's always that buyout. We hope you will not fire Tony and me this week. We've got a lot of stuff coming up this week, a lot of coverage. We've already been dropping some bonus shows in the Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning feed. Did an extra Buckeye weekly show for you on Sunday, looking at the Oregon-Michigan State game and some big takeaways from that. We're going to have a lot more coming up this week as well. We're going to be on our way out to Eugene, Oregon on Thursday. Got a lot of stuff before then. We're going to be talking to the Buckeyes on Tuesday and then again on Wednesday night. Heading on a plane out there on Thursday. We'll have coverage if the airlines are willing and the weather permits. We'll have coverage from out in Oregon starting for you late Thursday afternoon, early Thursday evening, and then all day Friday, all day Saturday, lots of coverage leading up to the game. I'm really excited to see this campus, really excited to see the stadium, really excited to see this game. There's a lot of stuff that is going to be brand new to Ohio State. And oh yes, by the way, it's number 2 versus number 3 in the country. Pretty big game as it turns out. We've been anticipating that for a while, and now it's here. Cannot wait. Cannot wait to see you at BuckeyeHuddle.com as well. That's where Tony, Kevin, and I cover the team. Mark covers recruiting. Got our whole team of X's and O's gurus there to make you a smarter football fan. Really fun and active board as well on the Huddle board presented by Jeff Ruby's Columbus. And also make sure you subscribe to us on YouTube at youtube.com/BuckeyeHuddle. Lots of content coming for you there this week as well. And all your podcast platforms of choice. We haven't asked you for a rating and review recently, so let's fix that. If you enjoy these shows, leave us a 5-star rating and review for Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning, Buckeye Weekly, Skull Session Recruiting Podcast. You can find all of our shows by searching Buckeye Huddle wherever fine podcasts are sold. We hope you enjoy these. Hope you leave us a 5-star rating and review as well. That will do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.